Good freaking morning, Alpha Gang. Today I'm over at Alberta Race Engines. We are going to discuss a change I decided to make on my engine build, as I want to take you along for any update I did as well. And I think today we're going to do like a little bit of a Q&A with Don as well about, say, your first time possibly building an engine of your own, some questions that you may have that hopefully I can answer in this Q&A, and a few other questions as well too, and some things to consider. But let's go inside and we will go from there.
So in this next section of the video, we do a time lapse of the teardown. So Don from Alberta Racing Engines will tear down the engine, and we compress the teardown into about 6 minutes, so you didn't have to sit through about an hour or so of teardowns. So hope you enjoy. So we're about the halfway point of the teardown. In the rest of the video, and same with the rest of the clips later in the video, we're going to go over a lot of information and details about open deck options as well as closed deck versus dart mid sleeves, and also go through the Q&A of some other info about engine building. So yeah, if you're interested in all those extra details and kind of what to expect if it's your first time building an engine, then stay tuned. We definitely have a lot more to come. So that now completes the teardown. So these next few clips kind of go over some of the components that he took apart, and I'll show you through these. So now it's time to get this engine cleaned up a little bit. Into the parts washer we go. And voila, all nice and clean.
Alright, so as you can see, we just pulled this out of the parts washer. What the parts washer does is just removes oil and some of the loose surface contaminants. Anything that's kind of caked on there or any sort of corrosion is not going to come off in the parts washer. So what we have to do in that case, or really every case, is we have to remove all the external plugs on the engine. So we have, pipe plugs, more pipe plugs, frost plugs. Sometimes there'll be plugs that are kind of melted in. They'll be made out of lead or something like that. So we have to remove all those. In some cases we then have to rethread the holes. And the reason we have to remove everything is because we're cleaning the exterior of the block with an abrasive blasting solution. So we can't have any of that media left over in the engine. It'll destroy the engine very quickly. So yeah, we have to remove everything and then physically take a pressure washer with brush attachments and clean out these rifle drillings for the oil passageways. We do this similar process for the coolant, like water jacket, things like that, coolant passages, and what that'll do is remove a lot of the scaling from the inside of your block from coolant. So yeah, it's not as simple as just tossing it in the washer. There is, I would say, on a 4-cylinder block like this, probably 2.5 to 3.5 hours of effort put into cleaning this to get it to shine. So yeah, there you have it.
Just a little update that I mentioned earlier in the video. I was talking about how I was going to make some changes to the build. It was more in relation to the dart mid sleeves that I talked about previously that I was planning on doing. Looking at some closed deck options as well. So I'll actually hand you off to Don, and he's just going to explain a little bit more on closed decking and what's that all about for engine blocks as well.
Hey guys, so what closed decking means is taking a block surface that has an open deck or a semi-open deck. This would be an open deck. But what it means is taking an open deck, machining the profile on both sides, and installing aluminum inserts to create a closed deck environment where the cylinder is more stable. So right now you can see with an open deck, the top of the cylinder could actually move under load, and under really heavy load you'll start to have head gasket failure due to the shift. So it'll fret the gasket, it'll wear the material, and then you'll actually get combustion gases in your water jacket. So what closed decking looks like, kind of the process, I'm missing one piece of the process here, but these are Subaru case halves. So this is just a raw, dirty block or case halve that we've installed inserts. Obviously it'd have to be decked and then cleaned up. But I want to use this one because it's a good example, because you can see exactly where the inserts are. So with a Subaru, they're 6 pieces. You can do it a number of ways, but we like to do 6-piece. This is what it looks like when it's all shiny and decked. So kind of as you can see, it creates a lot more strength and stability in the top of the cylinders. Therefore, the entire cylinder is stronger and more stable, resisting bending and flexing. So kind of general rule of thumb is, if you have a open deck engine, you're going to be limited to a certain amount of airflow and boost from your turbocharger. It's completely different on a naturally aspirated engine. But on a turbocharged engine, you're going to be boost limited. With a closed deck engine, you're going to start to run into other issues, but at a much higher horsepower rating. What'll happen is you're going to need to upgrade to a different style of head gasket. You might need to do copper O-rings, and a combination of copper O-rings and your MLS head gasket. Or you might have to do bigger head studs, for example, or a stronger material. So the closed decking will get you, generally, say your open deck engine starts to have issues around 300 to 400 wheel horsepower. Your standard closed deck engine will probably get you closer to 600-700. That'll be brake horsepower. So usually around 700 brake horsepower for a 4-cylinder. Closer to low 600s wheel horsepower. And then you'll start to run into issues where you need stronger studs, things like that. But yeah, the closed deck is a really, really good option. It's more economical than Dart and mid sleeves. Mid sleeves are incredibly complicated to machine the block to accept. It can be done with modern CNC equipment. Lots of people do it, including ourselves. But it's very expensive. There are a lot of shops that will do them on manual machines, and the price will be a lot more reasonable. But you'll pay for it because the sleeves will probably drop or they'll shift, and then you're looking at thousands and thousands of dollars to fix it properly. So to do it right the first time, these are awesome. I would recommend for full-blown drag engines or really high-power street cars, like 1,000+ wheel horsepower kind of thing. But if you don't have a really big budget and you don't have big horsepower goals, I would advise probably to not buy these and to do the closed decking. Closed decking is a proven method. The only reason OEMs don't do it is because of cost. So it's more expensive to create a casting mold that is a closed deck, because you then have the internal caverns that you have to evacuate during the agitation process where they get all the sand and stuff out of the casting. So it's more expensive to manufacture a closed deck engine, and as everyone knows, the automotive industry is about cutting costs and increasing profit. So yeah, that's the main reason why you don't really see them unless it's a really high-end car. Lots of high-end, Porsches, Audis, Lamborghinis, things like that. For the most part, they're all closed deck. Moral of the story is closed decking creates stronger cylinders. It's significantly cheaper than installing Dart and mid sleeves, and for 99% of the people out there, it's going to get you to your horsepower goals and also your reliability and budget goals. So it's something worth considering.
And once again, this kind of gives you an example of the closed deck setup versus the open deck setup on my current engine right here. As you can see, all these open channels here versus these closed deck options here.
In the time-lapse part of the video, Don was mentioning that the condition of the engine looked pretty good, but I also found some neat stuff while tearing the engine down as well too. So
while tearing the engine down, we found some pretty interesting things. Just before we get started on that though, I wanted to make a general comment on the condition of the engine and just how good it is. I don't know that I've ever seen an engine come apart with bearings looking as clean as this. So here's one of the main bearings, but if you have a look, you can see there's absolutely no scratches on this bearing, and actually you can still see the laser etched bearing size marker that Hyundai uses. Very interesting. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, first thing that we saw, obviously we started on the top end. So we pulled the cams. The cams themselves are in really, really good shape. There is a tiny bit of wiping. I don't know if you can actually capture it on the camera, but the very tip of the lobe does have a tiny bit of wiping, and that is normal. Every engine is more or less going to run into that. And actually, I think the contributing factor for that is the lifter buckets or cam followers, or like I said before, whatever people call them, because they have so many different names, is these actually appear to be, I don't know if it is actually DLC coating, but it is a coating, and it is probably very, very hard, because you can see my chicken scratch on here, but there are essentially no scratches on the top side, and this is where the cam lobe contacts, right? Like this rides on here like that, and that's how your valves are actuated. But the wiping on the tip is probably because this material is much softer than this material. So over time, probably hundreds of thousands of kilometers on this engine, eventually these tips would get fairly worn because this is so hard. But that's really cool. So you see a lot of the big motorsports supply companies are starting to move to DLC coated cam buckets, let's call them. And it's for that reason, is you don't get the wear on these. And the reason why you don't want wear on these is because it affects your valve lash. So you don't want these to wear. Actually, you don't want your valve tips to wear, you don't want these to wear, and you don't want your lobes to wear, because you want your lash to be maintained as close to the factory spec as possible, or whatever spec you set it to. But you don't want that to change over time, because that's going to change. It's going to change the operating envelope of your engine and how it runs and responds. So that's really cool. I also brought, for example, so these are both out of a Subaru. You can see here, I'll just pull two together. So this is out of the Theta, and then this is out of a Subaru. So you can clearly see that there's a hardness related coating on here. This is just hardened. It's hardened steel. It's high carbon hardened steel, but it's not going to be as hard as that. So that's pretty cool. What else do we have? So the mains looked really, really good. The thrust washers themselves also look really good. It's business as usual with these. Like, probably the best looking thrust washers I've ever seen, actually. One thing I thought was really interesting pulling this apart is the markings on everything. So like I said before, so the connecting rod is actually marked B. The bearing is also marked B. I'm not sure if you can see that, but it's right here. It's right there, and then the connecting rod is also marked. That's very interesting. I've never seen an OEM do it like that before. It makes a lot of sense, and it would make mechanics' jobs a lot easier to understand everything. It kind of takes away the fun of measuring things properly, which is what we're going to do. But also, while we're looking at this, and don't flame me too hard here, but looking at it, it looks like this connecting rod is cast just from kind of the grain structure on the steel. It's possible that it's forged, but to me it does look like it's cast iron. So I'll have to look into that a little bit, but that could be one of the reasons behind the strength issues with those. So we'll keep looking into that more. But so everything looked really good with the pistons. Here, I'll just grab another one so you can have a look. But the actual skirt, all of the wear, the wear on all the pistons looks just like this. So everything is lined up well from a machining standpoint, as you'd expect from the OEM. But there's no strange wear patterns. It's always right in the middle of the skirt, just like that. So this engine was built very well from the factory. Put up with a lot of abuse, I would imagine, without too much complaint. So everything looked really good. The one thing that we kind of skimmed past here and didn't really look at was the crank, and that's because it looks amazing. It's basically a mirror finish. So we'll measure it all up. We'll put it on the stands. We'll get the dial indicator out and make sure it's straight. I would have a very hard time believing this crank has a bend in it with how finely finished these journals are. This crank looks really, really good. Yeah, not too much to say about it. So we'll go through and blueprint everything, take all the measurements, and figure out what we need for bearings. But to be honest with you, if this wasn't a performance build, it could go back together essentially the same way it came apart, and the engine would run just fine. The only thing you'd want to do is, probably put in new rings and a light hone, clean the pistons up and whatnot. But yeah, this engine is in really, really good shape, and it's going to be, the perfect starting point for high performance engines. So it should be fun.
Alright, so I'm with Don at Alberta Racing Engines, and earlier in the video I did mention we do like a little Q&A of people that are thinking about building an engine and what's involved in the process. So we put together a few questions, so if you're not too sure how to start your build or the route to go to begin the process, this might help you out. And if you have any other questions, feel free to comment them down below in the comments, and then I can always get back to you or send you into the right avenue of where to get those questions answered. Of course, probably through Don, through Alberta Racing Engines. But let's get started with a few of the questions. So what kind of factors go into the price of an engine build, the pricing?
So there's obviously a lot of factors that go into determining the final cost of an engine build. I would say the two top ones are, your reliability and power goals for your build. How much horsepower do you want to make? How much torque? How long do you want the engine to last? So that's kind of, that's a big one. And another big one is the condition that your engine is in when you bring it to us. So have you spun a bearing? If you have spun a bearing, that is going to increase the cost big time. There's a lot of auxiliary components on the engine, your oil cooler, generally speaking, oil pump, a bunch of hoses and fittings and whatnot that are going to have to be replaced if they've been exposed to bearing material, because you can't really clean it out. You can clean it out of the big voids and castings and stuff, right? So when you're machining and cleaning, you can get all that out. But it's a big price increase. So it varies widely, and kind of how that works is, you send your engine to us, you tear it apart, and then we send you a quote based on the inspection. So there won't be any surprises. You'll know exactly what you're walking into when we start the build process.
Oh, cool. So like, how does the process go in terms of getting ready for an engine build? Like, how to bring it to the shop, like not in pieces or like full engine, like no accessories? How do you usually prefer that people like drop off an engine, for example, if they're getting ready for a build?
That's a good question. I'm happy we're covering that one. So we don't necessarily want to receive, a block casting, a head casting, and then a few cardboard boxes filled with bolts and camshafts and things like that. So what we would prefer is either an entire long block with no accessories on it, like no power steering pump, no AC, stuff like that, no alternator, just a bare long block. Or if you were really curious when you were taking it apart and you wanted to see, what your pistons look like or whatnot. So we'll take it as a head and then a short block separately, packaged or on a pallet or whatnot. That's another thing, is you can ship it to us, like say you're across the country or even outside of the country. We can receive engines on pallets or in boxes. It doesn't really matter. We have the capability to receive that. So
okay, cool. With that in mind, for the quotes and stuff, the best way to reach you, would that be like through email usually, or social media? Do you find, like, or you get a mix of both, or phone calls?
So it can be, just because we're actually a 3-man operation here. We would prefer to, if the customer reaches out on social media or through email. So our email address that we generally use for these types of inquiries is just sales@arebuilt.com. We all have our own individual emails, and once the inquiry comes in, it'll get forwarded off to whoever's gonna, deal with that. But that's that's the best way to reach us, actually. And
Okay. And I'll tag all that information below too. So if you're looking for their Instagram or the email to send inquiries as well, if you don't have, say, Instagram or social media, I'll put that down below as well in the description. So you can always find a way to get a hold of them as well for your own inquiries. Another question that came up, because it was also in social media where people were asking, they knew about the changes I was planning on doing with my build. But when we talked about why would someone go with a closed deck block versus dart mid sleeves, we did explain that earlier in the video. But also because of my power goals, we kind of came to an agreement that it was a little bit overkill to go the dart mid sleeve route. So then the option of going to a closed deck was more the way I was going to go, because I'm not looking for a crazy high horsepower, 700-800 plus horsepower car. I knew what goals I had in mind, and it's probably going to be anywhere from 450 to 500, which I find is going to be perfect for my goals for the track. But that was also another reason, just because it was overkill, and also the cost and the complexity of going the dart mid sleeve route. So to avoid that, it was just a better option to go the other route. So that pretty much answers that question if you're curious. Pistons, because I get this question sometimes through social media. A few guys have asked me about it. So they're mentioning oversized pistons versus like a stock bore size pistons. Why would you go one over the other?
That's really a question as well, and I'm happy we're covering that one because we get asked that a lot. So basically what's going on when your engine builder is a little bit hesitant to go with a drop-in piston is not that there's anything wrong with the piston. The piston's fine. It's a good piston, but the real issue, or what's going on here, is your piston to wall clearance. So what happens is if you bring your engine builder a worn out set of case halves or a block, or it doesn't have to be worn out, but used. So this dimension, the inside diameter of your piston or of your cylinder wall, is going to be larger than when it left the factory, right? So those pistons that were installed in the factory were set to the original size, and now that it's been running, it's going to be oversized, and actually generally it'll also be oval. It won't be a perfect concentric circle. So what you're going to be left with, or what's going to happen if you take a drop-in piston, OEM size piston, is it's going to go in there and it's going to run. It will run. It'll generally be fine. There will be excess blow-by because the cylinder is no longer round. And also what will happen is that blow-by, all the gases, it goes both ways. Like you push combustion gas into your engine case, but you also pull like oil vapor into your combustion chamber, and it'll carbon up the top of the piston very heavily over time. And also the walls, you can't really see it, but the walls will also get carbon and coke on them, and it'll create hot spots. And we all know what hot spots create, which is detonation. So you'll eventually get a lot more knock on an engine that has drop-in pistons. So basically what you want to do is, unless you have a brand new engine that you're pulling apart, you don't really want to go with drop-in pistons. You're going to run into a lot of longevity issues. The engine also, like from a sound standpoint, it'll more likely than not create slapping, like a slapping sound. And that's physically what's happening there is the cylinder wall is oval in this direction, the skirts of your piston. So these skirts, this diameter will be larger inside the cylinder walls. So that'll allow the piston to sit there and rock back and forth, and it'll actually beat these skirts eventually apart. They'll start to crack off, and then it'll crack off all the way up into the rings, and you'll lose compression in that cylinder, and it'll be a dead cylinder. So the long and the short of it is you really want to, if your budget allows, you want to go oversized, and you want to have it properly machined with a torque plate and properly honed with a torque plate, so that this dimension is a proper circle and also the right size. So you want to go a little tighter on the piston to wall clearance, generally speaking, than what the manufacturer's spec is. And I mean, we get into that case-on-case basis with our customers, but for a street car, you either want to look at a different material. Like 4032 is an aluminum alloy that's really good for street cars. You can go really tight on the piston to wall, it'll run super quiet, you'll have minimal blow-by. Or if you're on the fence about it, you can go with a standard racing piston, which is a 2618 aluminum alloy. It expands more, so sometimes it can be a little bit sloppy on cold start, but it'll give you a lot more breathing room in your tube. So it's actually a softer, well, it's tougher, but it's also softer, so it can take a little more abuse, and it's more malleable than the 4032. So kind of a little bit off topic there, but you can choose between different piston alloys for the use of the engine, right? But you know, the main point in there is the piston to wall clearance is incredibly important. So if you're doing a drop-in piston, you will run into issues. You'll probably get away with it for quite a while, until you don't. The piston will come apart eventually, and it'll start on the skirt.
The next question, because we were just talking about the piston sizes and such, but what kind of details do a lot of people not realize go into a proper engine build, like cleaning, teardown related, or clearances, cylinder wall condition, stuff like that? They think they can just buy pistons and just like, oh, you know, I fried a piston. They're just gonna buy another set of pistons, drop them in, and call it a day. Like, what kind of things do they don't consider, not realize if, you know, that it's something new to them in general for engine builds?
Yeah, no, this is something we see all the time with our, you know, I would say street car customers. Generally, racing customers know the finer ins and outs of engine building because they've been through so many engines. But yeah, no, we can totally cover that. I would say kind of the biggest things that people don't realize when entering into an engine build are exactly that, the finer details. So one thing is, so when we buy pistons or rods, or say you bring us pistons or rods, we don't just install the pistons and rods in your engine. First of all, we have to balance them, and balancing doesn't mean weight matching. We don't put them on the scale and find the ones that kind of line up for the firing order of the engine to counterbalance the reciprocating mass. That's something that was done in the past, not by us, but I mean like way in the past, like you know, 70s, 80s, maybe early 90s kind of thing. That's not really the way it works anymore with engine clearances and engine speeds. Gasoline engines used to be, you know, lower redline, somewhat similar to how diesels are set up now. So balancing wasn't as important, and there's a number of other reasons why it wasn't as important. But now it's very important. So what we do is we actually have a medical grade scale balancing rig. So we set up your piston on there, you know, one at a time. We measure your pistons and we try to get them within 0.3 of a gram, which really isn't very much. For example, like when the scale is sitting out on the bench, we have to put a box around it to prevent airflow, because just air moving around the room will affect the scale, sometimes up to like 0.1, 0.2 of a gram. So that kind of gives you an idea of what 0.3 of a gram is. It's not a whole lot.
Yeah, it's so fine.
Yeah, so what we do is we balance your pistons, we get all that sorted out, and that takes quite a while. That could be an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours, just to balance the pistons. And then we have to balance the rods, and that's more complicated because you have basically two hung members, and you have to get that balanced perfectly, or as perfect as you can, between the pin bore and the rod crank bore. So yeah, it takes quite a while to balance those. So all in all, you're looking at 4.5 to 5.5 hours for us to do that. And that's if we're being, you know, very, very delicate and careful. If it's an engine that we do a lot of, we can usually crank it out a little faster. But yeah, it's generally around, yeah, sometimes it could be a little less, like 3.5 hours. It doesn't really matter, but it's in that 3 to 5 hour range to do it properly. Another thing thing that people really overlook is the cleanliness. So you'll get an engine in. It's kind of hard to see this engine. It's pretty dirty. There's stuff all over the top of it. There's the aluminum is darkened, things like that. So it's usually a 3 or 4 step process to clean the block properly, and it takes no less than probably 2.5 to 3.5 hours for a 4-cylinder to clean the block. That's not even mentioning the head. The head probably adds 2.5-ish hours. So there's a lot of man hours that go into cleaning it properly. And you might think that that's, potentially overkill. Like, why not just put it in the washer, wash it, and be done with it? Well, you have to take out all the galley plugs and everything on the block because the machine material goes absolutely everywhere. When you're boring and honing, all those fine particles will find their way throughout the entire engine. Or if you're at home and you're using a ball hone, all of that metal flake that's going through the air is going into your coolant jackets, it's going into your oil return passages, it's going through the whole engine as soon as you fire it up. So it's very important to clean engines properly, not just so that you have a nice shiny exterior, but so that when you fire up your engine, all those contaminants aren't going through your main bearings and your rod bearings and your oil pump, drastically shortening the life of your engine. So I would say cleaning and balancing are the 2 really big things that people, I don't know if they really overlook or they don't really realize how important it is to begin with. There's a few other things, but those are the main points for sure.
Oh, okay, cool. There's a lot of little details that I didn't realize. Like even some people think that I know everything about these cars or whatnot, but bringing it to a professional definitely opened up my eyes on all the details. Even the quote, when I saw the quote of what was all involved, it already opened up my eyes with how many little fine details there are that are part of an engine build, even if it's just like a bottom end or something a little bit more simple or just a rebuild in general. There's just a lot of like really fine details that you don't think about, which makes sense when you look at the final cost of something like that, of how much work is involved. So yeah, it definitely all makes sense. What other, actually I'll skip this question, I'll get back to that in a little bit, but speaking of build stuff, like if parts or components for the build haven't been purchased for the engine, like from a customer, do you source and supply parts if needed? And is that something that should probably be mentioned in the initial discussion, like when they send you an email for their engine build?
Absolutely. If you've already purchased parts, that's something that we're going to need to know. We might have some suggestions, on potentially changing the build. A lot of times, and we're all, I wouldn't say guilty of this, but we all do this. We, piece builds together. Sometimes certain components aren't necessarily compatible with other components. Everyone has their brands that they like, and we all understand that. The optimum way to do it, I would say, is we receive the engine, tear everything apart, inspect everything, dimensionally audit it and whatnot, and then we would build the quote. We do sell parts. We sell a lot of parts. We do get really good pricing because of the volume that we go through, and yeah, absolutely, we can spec out your parts for you. Something that we have experience with, brands we have experience with, parts we have experience with. We can really help ensure that you have the right parts for the build. So
cool. And also, the question that I was going to ask before this actually is, besides engine building, what other services do you provide besides that? Like, do you do powder coating, for example, or whatnot?
Yeah. So it is mostly part sales and engine building. We can do powder coating and ceramic coating of small parts. We do have the ability to do that here on site. We have a nice little vacuum oven, so we can ceramic coat, piston tops, valve covers, things like that. The oven has a certain size, so we can't do headers. It's basically small engine components that we can do at this time. But essentially, it's the services we provide are part sales, build consulting, so we can help you spec out your entire build as well. We won't won't physically do the work on the rest of the car, but we can spec that stuff out for you. And then yeah, engine building, CNC machining, we can make you custom parts. If you have an idea for a part for your car or your engine, we can quote that for you and we can design it for you. You know, and obviously manufacture it. And then yeah, the engine building and the cleaning. That's kind of the whole envelope of what we do.
Cool, awesome. Those are pretty much all the questions I had for today. So I'd just like to take the time to once again thank you, John, for letting me come to the shop throughout the process and document this whole build. Because it's awesome to see behind the scenes, and I'm sure I get a lot of questions from you guys as well that want to see that process and what's all involved. So it was kind of cool that we got to do a time lapse of the teardown earlier in the video as well, and also go over the finer details of like why I changed certain things in the build, explanation on closed deck options of course as well too, which is pretty popular. But yeah, it was great once again. It's always a pleasure, of course, to talk to you, Don.
Yeah, thanks.
I love hanging out with you guys regardless, so this definitely doesn't feel like it's work or anything like that. It's a lot of fun hanging out with you guys, so yeah, lots of knowledge of course. So yeah,
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah, thanks for coming out, and thanks for taking the time to film everything and help us get the name out there. And mainly though, thank you for taking the time to allow us to explain the process, because that's the biggest thing in the engine building industry is customers don't necessarily always understand what goes into an engine build. So I think that's really helpful and insightful.
Awesome. So that pretty much wraps up the video. So if you did enjoy the video or want to comment or have any questions on anything we talked about earlier, or even new questions, feel free to drop a line on our Instagram. All the info for Alberta Racing Engines will be also down below in the description if you want to reach out to them for your own engine build or questions for them as well related to the video. But other than that, we'll see you on the next one. If you liked it, hit that like and subscribe, and we'll see you next one. See ya.